Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and during these half-hour shows I'll be interviewing writers about their craft, their ambitions, their dreams, their careers in writing. Those careers might be in poetry, they might be in journalism, fiction, nonfiction, they might be in advertising, copywriting. We plan to cast a very wide net. We'll be sharing information here on the Writer's Block, but we hope to have a good time doing it as well. The show will be varied, and it will be open to your comments. If you have ideas for us here at the Writer's Block, or if you'd like to be on the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the program. Tonight's guest is Chris Leahy. Chris is presently the Director of Conservation for the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And among other duties under that position, he helps manage 18,000 acres of sanctuary lands and the Society's international travel operation. In that connection, he has traveled to outer Mongolia, Antarctica, Patagonia, and many other remote climes pursuing wildlife. As a writer, he's also been busy. Chris's works include The Birdwatcher's Companion, about which we'll speak later, The First Guide to Insects, Introduction to New England Birds, and other books. He has just finished a guide to the natural history of New England to be published later this year. And, as if that were not enough to keep him occupied, he also oversees the publication of Sanctuary, the Audubon Society's journal. Let's go over now and meet Chris.
Hi, John. I've also been to Outer Magnolia.
Outer Magnolia, yes. There aren't as many wildlifes there.
Well, I don't know. You live in Outer Magnolia.
They're quite different, though, I take it. As I hinted before the show, I wanted to ask you, first of all, are you a writer or a naturalist? Or does it make a difference?
I guess it depends on which day you ask me. I guess I like to think of myself as both. It's a good combination. I've been interested in natural history. That sort of struck me as when I was a child at some point, and I guess the writing part came along later. But they've always gone together to a certain extent.
One of the most interesting questions I've heard asked on interview shows is, what is your earliest recollection? Was your earliest recollection watching wildlife, observing insects?
I guess the earliest recollection I have in that vein is something close to that. I remember, and I can date it to being age 6, of standing in front of a flowering bush and watching tiger swallowtails nectaring on the blossoms, and I have a sort of fairly vivid memory of that. And another memory very shortly after that of seeing a large moth trapped in a window. So there is that sort of
this is in New England.
Early event. That, as a matter of fact, happened in Virginia. I'm a New England type, basically, but that memory came from an earlier segment.
So if we took a chronological definition, you're a naturalist.
I suppose so, since I wasn't writing much at age 6.
When did you decide you wanted to write? Well, because certainly as a naturalist, you could be a field biologist and not be principally a writer, or chiefly a writer.
Yeah, I don't think that the two came together more or less. They came in sort of separate pieces. I sort of started as a naturalist, and then the artistic phase of my life took over. My first career was as an actor in the theater. And I hung out with literary types and other crazies, artistic types. And during that period of my life, sort of through my mid to late 20s, I more or less considered myself embarked on an artistic career. And like a lot of artists, thought that I was pretty much a polymath and could act, write, and do all of those things. And then sort of came back to natural history. And those two things then sort of melded together in a way. I mean, I ended up coming back, working for Massachusetts Audubon as a biologist, traveling a great deal. And then it fell very naturally into sort of writing, natural history articles and whatever. And, then a person comes along and says, "Do you want to write a book?" And I say, "Well, of course." And et cetera.
So you've come in a way full circle after your six-year-old, 7-year-old beginnings, you've picked up the abilities to express them and come back to that first?
Yeah, I guess I think it more as a sort of a sine curve than a circle. It would be nice now. I kind of feel like now I'm at a point where I'm almost like to sort of, go back to the artistic side a little more and start. I've seen a great deal of the world, and I've spent a good deal of my life looking at nature in many places, many sort of different ways, and it would be one of my sort of back burner dreams would be to have enough time to take that and use whatever talent I have as a writer to express all of that in an original way that I've not seen particularly done. There's a little ego there involved in my ability to do that, but that would be the dream that I spoke of, that you spoke of in the introduction.
I want to point out, if you haven't noticed, that in your honor, our costume designer made me wear this. In your honor, I don't know what it is. A pelican, I guess.
Black-capped chickadees, I think. Massachusetts State. It's wonderful.
You mentioned books, and I want to make sure that we tell our audience about a couple of those books we have here. Was this your... I'll hold this up here. Was this your first, second, third tome?
That's my largest book, and I guess it's the sort of major publication, I guess. Still is.
And this is going into its, I think...
It's going into a third printing. I was just told by my original editor, and I don't, but under a different sort of imprint. And so I don't know what that imprint is, and I don't know when it will be out or anything like that, but I am told that it will be, there's a likelihood that it will be out once again within the next year or so.
And this is, it should be on the shelves from its second printing, and will be in its third.
That's right. Yeah, there are nature stores and things like that, and places like Mass Audubon Bookstore will carry it.
This is, correct me if I misdescribed it, this is not a catalog of birds per se. It is a guidebook to...
No, it's not that either. It really is it's called encyclopedic, and it's in an alphabetical format, and I always think that probably puts some people off to a certain extent. But what people say about it to me, and the way I tried to write it, was that it's meant to be a kind of, the companion is sort of suggestive. It's meant to be something you can sort of dip into. There are lots of sort of long, hopefully interesting essays about things like migration and bird behavior, written in such a way to make them accessible to people who have an interest in birds but aren't, technically interested in the subject. And what pleases me most that people say about it is that it is indeed readable, that people can pick it up and sort of read passages of it, and that it's entertaining as well as just something to stick on the shelf or stick beside the door as a reference, kind of.
So if someone casually observes birds out their window but is not a birder, and they see a bird eating something they hadn't seen it eat before, they want to know about its habits, its feeding habits, they might turn to this.
Or things like migration. Anybody that feeds birds realizes that some birds are here during some seasons and not here during others, and that suggests all kinds of thoughts about migration and where are they and all that kind of thing. There are a number of places where you can look in this book and hopefully be entertained as you inform yourself about those phenomena.
Another book which you have brought us here, and I think this is available.
Oh yeah, this is
available. This is in the Peterson series of guides. This is titled fairly directly Insects, and by Christopher Leahy as well.
Great stocking
This is much more, as you can see, a sort of a field book. It would fit conveniently in a back pocket, and I think somewhat cheaper in price.
Yes, this is a series of books that the Peterson series has come out with.
They're
sort of
$3.95.
Only $3.95. Great stocking stuffer, and which are sort of scaled down versions of the larger, somewhat technical field guide. The insect guide, the regular Peterson series insect guide, is a wonderful book, but it's a little awe-inspiring in terms of its technical text. And this is sort of for someone who, I think it's particularly good. I wrote it with kids in mind, the kind of kid that I was, sort of running around looking under rocks and pulling out crawly things, saying, what's that? And this is a book that might get you close to being able to identify some of those.
So for this, you need not be an expert either.
Exactly, just the opposite kind of. I mean, it's meant to be sort of an introductory book.
We make sure to give plugs to all our guests.
Yes,
because we have a vast audience, and I think book sales are important. One of the reasons for the show is to promote interest in reading and writing, either professionally or casually. And I want to make sure that we give everybody a plug. The sort of writing you do is very similar, I think, in ways to the sort of writing that, at least occasionally, John McPhee does. Careful observation, sort of a very high, lofty style of journalism. Not that journalism is degrading in any way. Whom do you read, and why?
That's an interesting question. I guess I would say that my reading habits at the most general level are highly eclectic, and so that you would have sort of no clue to what that provides no particular insight. I read the New Yorker on a regular basis, and I like the kinds of high-level journalistic exercises that you've just described, and I suppose to a certain extent I have people like Peter Matheson and John McPhee or whatever who write about the natural world in a lot of ways with a not from the very narrow point of view of this is a wood duck, ain't it grand, and look how its head shines, but encompassing the human spirit and the aspects of the world as a whole within those sort of natural phenomena, and how those things relate to one's own life and to human life and that kind of thing. But as far as my own literary tastes are concerned, I'm sort of all over the map, and I don't read nearly as much fiction as I would like to or as I used to, simply because of time constraints. I'm essentially a sort of a bureaucrat these days, and so I find myself reading reviews of fiction in the New York Review of Books in order to replace the time I would like to be spending actually reading fiction, and I find myself reading a lot more nonfiction because of things I'm engaged in. I've just come back from almost a month in the Soviet Union, followed very hard upon by another month in Southeast Asia. And so I am currently reading a wonderful book by a man with the improbable name of Negli Farson. It sounds like an anagram to me, but some people in your audience probably know exactly who that is. He's quite a well-known journalist, I guess, back in the 20s and 30s. And he took a wonderfully eccentric sort of horse trek through the Caucasus in the Soviet Union, back when the Caucasus were really the Caucasus, when 18 different tribes from all over Eurasia lived there doing various strange things, including people who wore chain mail and were the descendants of the Crusaders, or thought they were at least. And he takes this journey at a time sort of just before Stalin came in and moved all those people off to Siberia and things. So a wonderful kind of travelogue. The other book I'm reading is Naipaul's book on Islam called Among the Believers, and that I had picked up. It's been around the house for a long time, and I'd started it. But wasn't particularly engaged, and just coming from Malaysia, which is an Islamic country, but totally different in aspect from what you think of when you think of Islam, imams and very dour people walking around and women all swathed in black, that I thought, no, this is a different kind of Islam, and I want to sort of learn something about that. And I'm not the kind of person who can start in the middle of a book, which is where he starts his Malaysian section. So I started at the beginning, and it's a wonderful book. So I'm deep into Ayatollahville at the moment, and Naipaul talks about being in a crowd of feeling slightly suffocated in a crowd of more than a million people, sort of all chanting and feeling unified. Very evocative.
Of course, Naipaul himself could pass for one of the million. It would be much more uncomfortable, I think, for us.
Sort of, although he was essentially uncomfortable about the fact that he is a non-believer, and he and his interpreter were constantly. He would go and have these sessions with some imam in a remote place, and they were constantly worried about blowing his cover as a non-believer. And this was at the time when, if you weren't towing the line, this is when British reporters were getting, and that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of that kind of tension. If you were not with the religious majority there at the time, you're potentially in big trouble.
When you were mentioning reading McPhee and others, and liking not only their observations, but how they put them in cultural and historical context. Can you tell us something about your educational background? Beginning, say, with late high school.
Well, as I said, after my sort of early sort of nature phase, I guess you would say, I very much segued into an artistic phase. And so from the time I was about 14, I essentially thought of myself as a professional, actor. I thought of myself as a poet, although I didn't write much poetry, but this was kind of, again, sort of 60s and, the romance of all of that kind of thing. And so that was very much my milieu. I was very much an English department kind of person. Went to college, University of Virginia, which had a very strong, and still has a very extremely strong English department program, lots of wonderful traditions of Faulkner and Jefferson and all of that kind of thing. Got very much involved in that, stayed with the artistic crowd, was essentially an English major, and so that's probably where a good deal of my literary tastes and talents, such as they are, were initially formed, etc.
So you were you graduated with a
BA in English literature. Yeah, I have no formal training in biology whatsoever, although I now run around and pronounce things about Massachusetts ecosystems and worldwide ecosystems on TV and other places.
So you're sort of in a tradition I think of as a Victorian English tradition of the generally educated self-created expert in biology or astronomy.
Yes, I couldn't have put it better myself. Yeah, that is sort of how it turned out. I didn't necessarily set out to do that, but that's kind of the way my interests have sort of led me. And it's interesting, if you look around, there are a lot of people, and especially people who have a broad knowledge in the sort of biological sphere, who have a more generalist background, rather than the guy. I mean, these days, if you start out in college with a career in biology, boy, you get on a very narrow track, and you end up studying the enzymes of a particular organism without having any idea necessarily what that organism is. You have to go to some naturalist and say, what is this I'm studying anyway? So
you might have to go to the naturalist to put it in decent prose as well.
Well, that's possible too, although that might not be your first choice. It's interesting. Your question about literary taste is interesting in terms of you may have noticed that I didn't mention any naturalist writers in terms of the people I read, aside from the John McPhee or whatever. And it's interesting that natural history writing is a backwater of sorts of the literary tradition, and one which it's sort of like wildlife art. You never see wildlife art in the art museum, and nature writing is often not displayed on the same shelf, so to speak, as real writing, and I think that's an interesting distinction.
That's sad, I think, essentially.
Yeah.
A name just flashed, an old Victorian name in connection with what we were talking about. Reed. I just ran across his name. Didn't know anything about him. I think he's mentioned in a Sherlock Holmes short story, but he's not fiction. Sherlock Holmes is reading him, and I guess I wondered if he is a prominent naturalist. He seems to be fairly obscure.
There were so many Victorian naturalists that my knowledge of them is not encyclopedic, but that doesn't ring any bells. Reed rings a bell because it was one of the early field guides, one of the early bird field guides in North America. Was a guy named Chester Reed. And he published a little book that everybody, sort of pre-Peterson, everybody sort of knew about, but is now sort of long forgotten. But he was not...
This Reed wrote extensively, I believe, about Africa. Livingston, sort of a person. I'm trying desperately to remember his first name, and I can't. I don't recommend him. Rather turgid. I would like to go back for a minute, where we don't have an awful lot of time left, to ask you again about something you mentioned earlier, your immediate future plans. You have a couple books coming out, but you said that you wanted to be more creatively free?
Yeah, it's not so much a plan as a dream, I think. One must make one's living, and one does it at the moment essentially as a sort of an administrator in the environmental field, and I love that, and that's wonderful. But if somebody said, oh, you have 2 years now, go pursue your fancy, I would love to. I've done a tremendous amount of traveling in the last 20 years. And I would love to have the time to put that together with whatever literary gifts I may or may not have, and try to bring out of that a different kind of travel book. I'm not sure what that means, sort of a Nabokovian travel book or something of that kind, some sort of great romantic melding of the natural world as it is still, but as I think it is about to disappear, and all the sort of the human comedy and all of the things that that is the setting for. So to speak.
Would this be something like Paul Theroux's work, his travel work?
No, I think it would ultimately be much less itinerary oriented. Thoreau tends to travel and write then out of his head. He admits this himself. He's not very interested in traveling or the places he goes.
Certainly isn't.
He often hates the places he goes to, but he uses those places to kind of remind him of something interesting he has to say, and does that. And that's obviously a viable methodology. He sells lots of books. I have much more in mind a sort of, Thomas Pynchon natural history kind of something, sort of a phantasmagoria that involves sort of the human condition, but with the natural world sort of blended in.
I have to say I'm relieved to hear that it's going to be very unlike Paul Theroux. When Paul Theroux was halfway to Patagonia in the Patagonia Express, I decided not to read any more Paul Theroux. We probably will never get him on the show, but I couldn't understand visiting and slamming so consistently and brutally the cultures you're visiting.
I must say I have the same reaction. I mean, it's entertaining to read some of them, but some of them were so negative that it's hard for me, having been to some of those places, to feel very sympathetic about them.
You mentioned just now that you wanted to have a major theme in your future work about the disappearance, or the quick disappearance, and your title at present at the Audubon Society is Director of Conservation. Will that be a theme through multiple works to try to preserve or to warn about the disappearance of natural life?
No, I mean that's my job, and I guess if I continue to write books like the Nature Guide that hopefully will be coming out sometime shortly, that is a sort of an ongoing theme. I think that's an ongoing theme for world society these days. But again, in terms of my fantasy literary life that involves natural history, that would only be suggested metaphorically. I think there is a sort of a doom-crying literature about the face of the planet, which I personally don't find very good reading, probably because I'm immersed in it all day long. But that's not something I'm particularly interested in pounding on as a writer.
Because it's being pounded on enough?
It's being pounded on. It's not very interested in reading. It's true.
It's true.
It's true, and it needs to be said, and people need to hear it, and people need to act on it. But it's not great. It's not great literature, and it's not very interesting to write that kind of stuff. One of the great constraints about writing something like an encyclopedic book on bird life is that you have to tell the truth all the time, at least partly. And there's so many strange and funny things, and there's so many facts about birds that would be very interesting if you could change them just a little bit. But it's very tempting to sort of slip in some factoids.
So now you can slip that
with
stuff
with my fantasy
future.
work, I could do that.
I just got a high sign. We have very little time left. A few weeks ago, we had some young writers on the show who were seniors in high school, and I asked them all what they were going to do at college. They're all going to major in English. Would you recommend that in 20 words or less?
I would, and I would recommend what we talked about earlier, not declaring your major when you're 12 years old, but waiting until you're 45 or something, and in the meantime, learning about the world as an English major, as a naturalist or whatever. That's for me. I mean, it's worked for me at least. A tremendously rewarding way to live one's life, rather than deciding you are an X and following the track.
And be tracked. Good. I want to present you with a gift that all the writers on the Writer's Block receive, a jar of whiteout. I don't get kickbacks or anything. It's purely
it's wonderful.
Purely functional.
I have gone through many of these.
I'm going out of style with the computer.
That's right.
Age,
yeah.
But,
I hope the last time I used this, it would clog up on me about halfway through the jar. So
yes. This has recently improved. I think the toxins have been taken out. Occasionally our studio audience responds to our guests when they're very, very pleased. We have a box full of dead poets in here. So thank you very much for being on the show, Chris. I appreciate the time. Thank you for being with us as well. I hope you've learned something about writing, about Chris's efforts at writing. If you have, then the Writer's Block has been a success. Please be with us next time on the Writer's Block. Good night.